There are 609 words in the Sermon on the Mount. 609 words that Western civilization has called the most perfect moral teaching ever delivered by a human being, the cornerstone of Christian ethics, the speech that reshaped how humanity thinks about the poor, the grieving, and the violent. And here is what nobody told you in 12 years of religious education, or 30 years if you went further than most. 500 years before Jesus stood on that hillside in Galilee, a man sitting beneath a fig tree in northern India delivered a moral teaching so similar in structure, in specific language, and in moral logic that scholars who compare the two texts side by side reach a conclusion that cannot be easily dismissed. The parallels are not vague. They are not poetic echoes. They are specific enough that Burnett Hillman Streeter, one of the most respected New Testament scholars Oxford ever produced, a man who spent his career defending the integrity of the gospel tradition, wrote that the moral teaching of Buddha has, and I am quoting him directly, a remarkable resemblance to the Sermon on the Mount. Not a resemblance in general spirit, a resemblance in specific sayings, specific structures, specific moral reversals that appear in both traditions centuries apart. The question this raises is not whether Jesus copied Buddhism. I am not going to say that. The question is something harder and more important. How did the same ideas, sometimes in nearly identical words, appear in two separate civilizations across the full width of the ancient world, 5 centuries apart? Because the answer to that question is buried in the historical record. And when you dig it out, it changes what you think you know about the origins of the most influential teaching in Western history. Let me start with the text itself. Not interpretation, not theory. The text. The Beatitudes, the opening lines of the Sermon on the Mount, begin in Matthew 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Luke's version, which most scholars consider the older form of the tradition, says it more directly. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now here is Dhammapada, 15 verse 4. Compiled approximately 250 years before the Common Era, predating the Gospel of Matthew by at minimum 250 years. Let us live most happily, possessing nothing. Let us feed on joy, like radiant gods. The same moral reversal, the same inversion of conventional value. The poor as the fortunate ones, the ones who possess nothing as the ones who have everything. You could read that parallel and say, spiritual traditions often arrive at the same insight. The human spirit reaches similar wisdom independently. That argument is legitimate. But then you hit the second one. And the second one is harder to explain. Luke 6, verse 29. Jesus, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. That is one of the most distinctive commands in the entire Sermon on the Mount, a teaching so radical, so counterintuitive that it has defined Christian ethics for 2,000 years and still makes people uncomfortable in the 21st century. Now here is Majjhima Nikaya 21, verse 6. Date of compilation? No later than 250 BCE, at minimum 500 years before the Gospel of Luke was written. Buddha says, if anyone should give you a blow with his hand, with a stick, or with a knife, you should abandon any desires and utter no evil words. The passive response to violence, the refusal to retaliate. Not just the idea in the abstract, the specific scenario of being struck. In both texts, 500 years apart. And then there is the golden rule. Luke 6, verse 31. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Dhammapada 10, verse 1. Consider others as yourself. Different words, identical moral architecture. 500 years apart. Marcus Borg, a scholar at Oregon State University who spent years setting New Testament passages next to Buddhist scriptures in systematic comparison, cataloged more than 24 specific parallels of this kind. His eventual conclusion, offered with the caution of a careful academic: the similarities of their wisdom teaching may flow out of the similarity of their religious experience. He offered that as an explanation. He also knew, as any scholar who reads both texts closely knows, that the verbal and structural similarities are too specific for that explanation to be fully satisfying. Because when three teachings this specific appear in this similar A form across 5 centuries and 5,000 kilometers, coincidence stops being an explanation. It becomes a refusal to ask the harder question. What I am going to show you in this video is 3 things. First, the parallels themselves, not cherry-picked, but systematic, the way scholars like Borg laid them side by side over years of careful work. Second, the historical evidence that these ideas did not need to travel by accident, that there was an actual, documented network of contact between Buddhist missionaries and the Jewish world centuries before Jesus was born. Third, what Clement of Alexandria and Origen, 2 of the most educated church fathers in early Christian history, knew about Indian philosophy, and why that thread was quietly cut. By the end of this video, you will not be able to dismiss these parallels as coincidence. I am not going to tell you what to believe, but I am going to show you what the evidence says. And I am going to leave you with one question that I have been sitting with for a long time. Before I go any further, if this kind of investigation matters to you, hit subscribe and leave a like. That is what tells YouTube this content has value, and it gets this kind of work in front of the people who need to see it instead of the usual programming. It means a lot. The question is not whether these parallels exist. Every scholar who has seriously compared the texts agrees that they do. The question is, how did the same ideas, sometimes in nearly identical language, appear 5 centuries apart and a full world away? And when you dig into the historical record, the answer is not mystical. It is archaeological. It is written in stone. Literally. I want to slow down here and walk through these comparisons the way Borg did. Not jumping from one to the next for effect, but actually sitting with each one long enough for the weight to accumulate. Because the weight is the point. The Beatitudes are the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus delivers 8 of them in Matthew 5. 8 declarations of blessing for the people the world considers losers. The poor, the grieving, the meek, the hungry, the peacemakers. The moral logic underneath all 8 is always the same. The world's conventional hierarchy is inverted. The ones at the bottom are the ones closest to the thing that matters most. Now look at the Dhammapada, compiled approximately 250 years before the Common Era. The word itself means, roughly, the path of the teaching. It is one of the most beloved texts in the entire Buddhist canon, and it has been studied by Western scholars since the 19th century. In chapter 15, you find this: among those who are not free from passion, I dwell free from passion. Among those who are afflicted with pain, I dwell free from pain. Among those who are greedy, I dwell without greed. It is not a word-for-word match. It is something more interesting than that. It is the same moral architecture. Blessedness through detachment. The interior state as the source of freedom, not the external circumstance. The Beatitudes of the New Testament are structured around exactly this logic. It is not your bank account or your social standing that determines your proximity to the kingdom. It is your interior orientation, your poverty of spirit, your hunger for righteousness. The Dhammapada reaches this conclusion 5 centuries earlier in language that mirrors the shape of the argument. But the parallels get more specific. And this is where a careful reader begins to feel genuinely uncomfortable. In Matthew 5, verse 39, Jesus says, "Do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Commentators have wrestled with this command for 2,000 years. It is non-intuitive. It is, in the conventional sense, almost insane. You are struck. You offer yourself to be struck again. No defensive response, no proportional retaliation, radical non-resistance. And then there is the Majjhima Nikaya 21, the text scholars call the parable of the saw. Buddha is speaking to a group of monks. He sets a scenario. Even if bandits were to cut you apart with a two-handled saw, limb by limb, the one among you who let his heart grow angry at that would not be following my teaching. The instruction is to maintain non-retaliation at the absolute limit of human suffering. The moral demand in both texts is identical. Your response to violence defines you morally, not the violence itself. These are not the same text, but they are operating on the same moral frequency, at the same radical pitch, making the same counterintuitive demand. Two teachers, 5 centuries apart, saying something that runs directly against every human instinct, and saying it in a way that is structurally parallel. The third parallel is the one that stayed with me longest. When I was putting together a comparative religion unit for my world history class, this was at a Catholic school in Indiana in the early 2000s, I set Matthew 7, verse 12 next to Dhammapada 10, verse 1. I was alone in the classroom, and I sat there looking at those two passages and understanding, for the first time, that in 12 years of teaching history at a religious institution, nobody had ever shown me this. Matthew 7, verse 12. Jesus, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Dhammapada 10, verse 1. Consider others as yourself. 7 words against 23. The principle, identical. The moral framework underneath, identical. And the Buddhist text predates Jesus by 500 years. Now here is the honest counterargument. The Golden Rule appears across multiple ancient cultures. In Confucius, in ancient Egypt, in Talmudic literature. Its appearance in both Buddhist and Christian scripture can be explained with some legitimacy as independent convergence on a universal moral insight. Different traditions, same destination. The human spirit arriving at similar wisdom. That argument holds for the Golden Rule in isolation. But the Sermon on the Mount does not just contain the Golden Rule. It contains the non-retaliation teaching, and the Beatitudes structure, and the poor as blessed, and the internal state as the determinant of virtue rather than external observance, and the unity of self and other as the ethical foundation. Not one overlap, not two. Multiple specific structural parallels. In specific scenarios, in specific moral reversals that are anything but obvious, appearing in both traditions. And it is the accumulation that shifts the question. From, is it not interesting? To, what actually happened here? To understand how this accumulation became possible. To understand why 5 separate specific moral teachings appear in nearly parallel form in 2 traditions 5 centuries apart. We need to go back 2,300 years. Not to Galilee. To the court of an emperor in northern India who had just witnessed something that would change the world in ways that nobody recognized at the time. And the first thing he did with that change was send ambassadors. Into a world much closer to Palestine than anyone has told you. The year is approximately 268 before the Common Era. The city of Pataliputra, roughly where the modern city of Patna sits today in northeastern India. A new emperor has just consolidated control over the largest empire in the subcontinent's history. His name is Ashoka, and he rules the Mauryan Empire. About 8 years into his reign, Ashoka launches a military campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga, modern Odisha, on the eastern coast of India. The campaign succeeds militarily. The cost is catastrophic by any measure. According to Ashoka's own records, carved into stone, not written by his enemies, 100,000 people were killed in battle. 150,000 more were deported. Many more died from famine and disease in the aftermath. Ashoka surveyed what his army had done and experienced something that the historical record describes as a profound turning point. He turned toward Buddhism, and then he did something that no emperor before him had done in quite this way. He decided that the most important thing he could accomplish with imperial power was to spread the moral teaching of the Buddha, not through further conquest, through emissaries, through what his own inscriptions call Dhamma envoys, ambassadors of the ethical teaching. We know what happened next, not from later tradition, but from physical evidence, from stone. Ashoka commissioned a series of inscriptions carved into rock faces and stone pillars across his empire. These inscriptions, the edicts of Ashoka, are among the most important documents that survive from the ancient world. They describe, in Ashoka's own words, his conversion to Buddhist ethics and his systematic program of sending representatives of the teaching westward. And the major rock edicts, specifically Edict 13 and Edict 2, do not speak in vague terms about the West. They name the specific kings to whom Ashoka sent his missionaries: Antiochus II of Syria, Ptolemy Theku of Egypt, Magas of Cyrene in modern Libya, Antigonus of Macedonia. These are not obscure kingdoms at the edge of the known world. These are the major powers of the Hellenistic world, the Greek-speaking civilization that surrounded the Eastern Mediterranean, the world that bordered and shaped and eventually gave birth to the cultural context in which Jesus of Nazareth grew up. Ashoka sent documented Buddhist missionaries into the world adjacent to Palestine 250 years before the Common Era. This is not a theory. It is what the edicts say. But here is the piece that moves this from significant to undeniable. In Kandahar, in modern southern Afghanistan, at the eastern frontier of the Greek world, archaeologists in 1958 uncovered something extraordinary: a bilingual inscription from Ashoka's reign, dating to approximately 258 BCE, one half in Greek, one half in Aramaic. Aramaic, the spoken language of Jesus of Nazareth, the language in which the original form of the Sermon on the Mount was almost certainly delivered, the language of the Jewish communities in Palestine in the 1st century of the Common Era. In the Aramaic portion of the Kandahar Edict, Ashoka translates the concept of Dhamma, the Buddhist ethical teaching, into a native Aramaic philosophical term. Buddhist philosophical vocabulary, actively translated into Aramaic, carved in stone, in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Not a hypothesis, not speculation. Physical stone that exists, that scholars have studied, that is in the historical record. This is the piece that most people who have studied comparative religion for decades have never encountered, because it transforms the conversation from coincidence to contact. There was a network. There were emissaries. There was documented Buddhist philosophical vocabulary crossing between the Eastern world and the Aramaic-speaking world 300 years before Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And as Elmar Gruber and Holger Kirsten documented in their detailed 1996 study, Buddhist teaching had reached Jewish communities in the Levant via these established trade and diplomatic routes. Their argument, carefully evidenced, is that Jesus was born into a world where Buddhist ethical ideas had been circulating in some form for generations, not as a foreign import consciously identified as such, as part of the intellectual and spiritual atmosphere. And the network does not end in Kandahar, because there is one more piece of historical evidence that pulls this thread even closer to the specific place where Christianity's theology was actually built, not in Palestine, but in the city that connects every strand of this conversation into a single thread. Alexandria, Egypt. 2nd century before the Common Era. The greatest library ever assembled. The intellectual capital of the ancient world. The meeting point of Greek philosophy, Egyptian mystery tradition, Jewish scholarship, and the accumulated knowledge of the Eastern Mediterranean. the city that produced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and that would later produce some of the most sophisticated theological minds in early Christian history. The historian Jerry H. Bentley, a respected scholar of cross-cultural interaction in the ancient world, documented that there were active Buddhist communities in Alexandria, Egypt, from at least the 2nd century before the Common Era. Buddhist communities. In Alexandria, 200 years before Christianity began developing its first theology in that same city. Think about the historical geography of this. The city where the early church produced its most sophisticated intellectual defenders, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, is the same city where Buddhist philosophical communities had been active for generations before Christianity arrived. Not in separate intellectual worlds, in the same city, in the same library culture, in the same network of philosophical conversation. Gruber and Kirsten traced how Buddhist doctrinal affinity reached Jewish communities, not just through missionaries, but through the structure of the teaching itself. The way the Sermon on the Mount's inner logic mirrors the structure of Buddhist ethical teaching, not just isolated sayings. The parallels are architectural, not just lexical. The way the teaching is built, systematic, inverted, grounded in interiority, follows a Buddhist pedagogical pattern more closely than it follows anything in the Jewish prophetic tradition. And here is the part that the institutional church finds most uncomfortable. Because the church fathers knew. Not as a secret they were actively suppressing. As a fact they were aware of and chose not to foreground. Clement of Alexandria, one of the most educated men in early Christianity, writing in the late 2nd century, explicitly mentions what he calls gymnosophists in his writings. Gymnosophists, the Greek term for Indian ascetics, the naked philosophers of the East. Clement mentions them alongside Egyptian priests and Persian magi as groups whose philosophical traditions had contributed to the development of wisdom in the ancient world. He was not ignorant of Indian philosophy. He was aware of it. He situated it as part of the broader heritage of human wisdom. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, arguably the most intellectually formidable theologian the early church produced, was working in Alexandria's tradition of encyclopedic learning. He was familiar with the full range of Hellenistic philosophy, with Jewish mysticism, with the intellectual currents that flowed through the most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world. He was aware, as any educated person in Alexandria would have been, that there were philosophical traditions from the East bearing striking resemblances to Christian moral teaching. Neither Clement nor Origen said, Buddhism anticipated Christianity. That conclusion would have been institutionally catastrophic in a world where the Church was fighting for its theological distinctiveness against every philosophical rival. But their awareness of Indian philosophical tradition is documented in their own texts, and that documented awareness means something specific. The early church was not ignorant of the parallels, it was managing them. That is a different thing from ignorance. Ignorance is innocent. Management is a choice. Here is the arithmetic of this problem laid out as plainly as I can make it. If the parallels between Buddhist teaching and the Sermon on the Mount were one or two general ideas, love your neighbor, cultivate inner peace, you could explain them as independent convergence. Different traditions arriving at the same destination by different roads. That is a legitimate explanation for one parallel. Maybe two. But the count is higher than two. Borg catalogs more than 24 specific parallels. Not in general principle, but in specific moral scenarios, specific inversions of conventional value, specific structural choices about how moral teaching should be organized. The struck cheek, possessing nothing as freedom, the internal state as the determinant of virtue, the poor as blessed, the unity of self and other as the ethical foundation, the systematic structure of paradoxical blessing. At the same time, you have Ashoka's edicts sending documented Buddhist missionaries into the Aramaic-speaking world 300 years before the Sermon on the Mount. You have Buddhist communities in Alexandria for 2 centuries before Christianity developed its most sophisticated theology there. You have the Kandahar bilingual edict proving that Buddhist philosophical vocabulary was being actively translated into Aramaic in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And you have church fathers who were aware of Indian philosophical traditions and chose not to make that awareness central to their theological project. The mathematics here do not leave room for comfortable coincidence. Something connected these traditions, not necessarily direct textual copying, something more interesting than that, and more historically traceable. Philosophical transmission does not require one person reading another person's text. It travels through teachers and through communities and through the accumulated wisdom of trade routes and wandering ascetics and diplomatic emissaries. It travels through the intellectual atmosphere of cities like Alexandria, where different traditions were in constant contact. It travels through generations of ethical teaching that shape how a culture thinks about the poor and the violent and the meek before any individual teacher ever opens his mouth on a hillside. The question was never, did Jesus read the Dhammapada? The question is, what was in the air of the world he was born into? And the answer, documented in stone, in edicts, in the writings of the Church Fathers themselves, is that Buddhist ethical ideas had been circulating in the world adjacent to Palestine for 300 years before the Sermon on the Mount. And here is where I need to be precise, because there is a frame on this story that is both emotionally satisfying and intellectually wrong. And if I let you walk away with that frame, I have not actually told you what the evidence says. I am not saying Jesus copied Buddhism. I want to say that as directly as I know how. Here is what the evidence supports, stated precisely. Jesus lived in a world that had been in contact with Buddhist philosophical ideas for at least 3 centuries before he was born. Not direct textual transmission. We have no evidence that Jesus read the Dhammapada in any form, and that kind of direct evidence probably does not exist and may never have existed. But philosophical transmission does not require direct textual contact. It travels through the intellectual atmosphere, through communities, through teachers whose sources are multiple and whose tradition is wider than any single text. J. Benitez, who spent decades investigating the historical Jesus with a seriousness that other investigators dismissed, describes Jesus in Caballo de Troya with a quality of moral wisdom that consistently exceeds the boundaries of the Jewish tradition he was born into, a wisdom broader than the Torah, deeper than the Pharisaical tradition, a compassion for the poor and the marginalized that goes further than any Jewish prophetic text had prepared anyone to expect. Benitez's portrait is of a Jesus who drank from sources older and wider than any single tradition. This video is not a challenge to that portrait. It is the historical architecture that makes that portrait plausible. Because if there was a network, and there was, and if Buddhist ethical ideas were circulating in the Aramaic-speaking world, and the evidence says they were, then the extraordinary quality of Jesus' moral teaching becomes explicable not as something dropped from the sky and into a vacuum, but as something that emerged from a man of unusual depth who had access, in ways we can now partially trace, to the deepest wells of human wisdom his world had to offer. The frame I want to leave you with is not, Jesus copied Buddha. The frame is, something was being taught. Something very old. Something that reached both of them, through routes we can now partially document. And what is remarkable is not that the teachings overlap. What is remarkable is that a man in 1st century Palestine synthesized that accumulated moral wisdom, whatever its sources, into a form that 2 billion people would still find transforming 2,000 years later. That is not a small thing. But it is a different thing from the institutional story. And that difference is why the comparison has been, for most of us, carefully kept off the table. And here is where this stops being history and starts being about you. Because the specific sayings we have been comparing, the poor as blessed non-retaliation, do unto others, the inward state as the seat of virtue, These are not abstract theological positions. They are instructions for how to live. And when you understand where they may have come from, when you understand the depth of the stream they flowed from, it changes what it means to take them seriously today. When I was building that comparative religion unit in Evansville, the thing that surprised me most was not the parallels themselves. It was my own reaction to finding them. I had spent 12 years teaching world history at an institution whose explicit mission was the formation of Catholic identity. I was not hostile to the faith. I had the faith. What I had not had, what nobody in 12 years of religious education had given me, was an honest account of the intellectual world that produced Christianity. I remember setting the Beatitudes next to the corresponding sections of the Dhammapada and feeling something that I can only describe as a kind of vertigo. Not the vertigo of losing faith. The vertigo of realizing that what I had been told was unique was actually part of something much larger. Something that had been flowing through human civilization for centuries before Jesus was born. When the department head told me to put the unit aside, I did not argue. I was in my 30s. I had a mortgage and 2 kids in school. But I also understood, sitting across from him in that office, exactly what we were both protecting. Not faith in Jesus, the institutional claim that what Jesus taught had no antecedents. That the Sermon on the Mount was a revelation that had no precedence in human history. Because if it did, if the same specific moral teaching had appeared in systematic form 500 years earlier in a tradition that was actively sending missionaries into the Jewish world, then the Church's claim to unique access to divine moral truth becomes complicated. Not the faith, the institutional claim. Here is what Bart Ehrman, who has spent his career doing the kind of textual analysis that the institutional church has always found uncomfortable, has observed about the early Christian tradition. The writers of the New Testament were not operating in an intellectual vacuum. They were writing in the Greek-speaking world, drawing on Greek philosophical categories, Jewish prophetic tradition, and the accumulated wisdom of a Mediterranean culture that was far more interconnected than the Sunday school version of the story admits. Elaine Pagels, in her work on the Nag Hammadi texts, documented how the earliest Christian communities were far more diverse in their theological sources than the later institutional church was willing to acknowledge. The Christianity that won the institutional battle, the one that became orthodoxy, was one specific reading of Jesus' teaching. Other readings, drawing on other sources, were systematically excluded. The question is not whether those other readings existed. They did. The Nag Hammadi library proved it. The question is what they were drawing on, and the evidence suggests that at least some of the earliest Christian communities were drawing on traditions with roots much older and much wider than the Church has been comfortable acknowledging. Marcus Borg was not working alone and was not working from a fringe position. The Pali Text Society, which has systematically catalogued Buddhist texts since the 19th century, has produced a substantial body of scholarship on the New Testament parallels. Burnett Hillman-Streeter of Oxford, who identified 4 specific structural resemblances between Buddhist teaching and the Sermon on the Mount, was a mainstream New Testament scholar in the early 20th century. Not an iconoclast. Gruber and Kirsten, working from a historical rather than textual angle, traced the missionary roots with scholarly rigor. The finding, that there are systematic, specific, structurally significant parallels between Buddhist teaching and the Sermon on the Mount, is not a finding of fringe scholarship. It is a finding that has been documented by multiple independent researchers across more than a century of comparative religious studies. And it has been, with remarkable consistency, kept out of the religious education curricula that most Christians received. That pattern of omission is itself a data point. There is one more layer to this. One more piece that connects these traditions in a way that makes the specific structure of the Sermon on the Mount more than coincidental. And it involves a concept that was functioning in the Jewish world before Jesus was born in a form that most Christians have never encountered. I want to return to the Kandahar edict one more time, because it deserves more attention than I have given it. 1958. A French archaeological team working near Kandahar in what is now southern Afghanistan uncovers a stone inscription from Ashoka's reign, dating approximately 258 before the Common Era. The inscription is bilingual, Greek on one side, Aramaic on the other. The Greek text promotes what it calls eusebeia, the Greek philosophical concept of piety, reverence, proper conduct toward gods and humans. But in the Aramaic portion, the equivalent term is not a Greek loanword transliterated into Aramaic script. It is a native Aramaic philosophical term actively chosen to translate Ashoka's concept of Dhamma, the Buddhist ethical path. Someone sitting at the junction of the Greek and Aramaic-speaking worlds in the 3rd century before the Common Era was engaged in active philosophical translation work, taking Buddhist ethical vocabulary and rendering it in the language that Jesus would use 3 centuries later. This is not a hypothesis. The inscription exists. It has been studied by historians of the ancient world. It is in the scholarly record. And what it proves is not that Jesus read Ashoka's edicts. What it proves is that the intellectual infrastructure for the transmission of Buddhist ideas into the Aramaic-speaking world was not merely possible. It was happening, actively, with the resources of an empire behind it. Now consider what we know about the Essenes, the Jewish community that lived near the Dead Sea and produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes practiced communal property, nonviolence, ritual bathing, and a form of ethical perfectionism that scholars have found difficult to fully account for within the bounds of the Jewish prophetic tradition alone. Several historians who worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls have noted structural similarities between Essene practice and Buddhist monastic community. The timing is consistent with Ashoka's missionary program. The geographical proximity, the Levant, adjacent to Palestine, is consistent with the missionary routes the edicts document. We cannot prove that the Essenes were directly influenced by Buddhist missionaries. The evidence does not go that far, and I am not going to claim it does. But the structural similarities are noted in the scholarly literature. And Jesus, by the testimony of his own time, was closely associated with the circle around John the Baptist, who most scholars believe had connections to the Essene communities in the Judean desert. The network, if it existed, would have reached Jesus not through a book, but through the community he was formed in. Remember the Kandahar inscription I mentioned earlier, Buddhist vocabulary carved in Aramaic 3 centuries before the Sermon on the Mount. That is not a footnote. That is the smoking gun, because it means that the network was not imaginary. It was documented in stone. The transmission was happening in the specific language that Jesus grew up speaking, in the specific part of the world adjacent to where he was born, in the specific centuries before he was born. And what Elaine Pagels found at Nag Hammadi, what Bart Ehrman's textual work keeps confirming, is that the Christianity that was suppressed was the one that was most comfortable with those wider sources. The Christianity that won was the one that needed to be unique. That needed the Sermon on the Mount to have no antecedents, because the institutional power of the church depended on that claim. If you have watched this far, you are already in a very small group. Most people who encounter this topic want one of 2 things: either a takedown, Jesus was just a Buddhist copycat, or a defense. These parallels are exaggerated and out of context. You got neither of those things. What you got is the evidence, the actual historical evidence. You now know that the Sermon on the Mount's most specific and radical moral commands, non-retaliation, the poor as blessed, do unto others, appear in Buddhist texts that predate it by 5 centuries. You know that Emperor Ashoka sent documented Buddhist missionaries into the Hellenistic world adjacent to Palestine 250 years before the Common Era. You know that those missionaries were working in Aramaic, Jesus' own language. You know that the Kandahar bilingual edict is physical, archaeological proof that Buddhist philosophical vocabulary was being actively translated into Aramaic 3 centuries before the Sermon on the Mount. You know that Clement of Alexandria and Origen, the church fathers who built Christian theology, were aware of Indian philosophical traditions and chose not to foreground that connection. You cannot unknow that now, and that puts you in a genuinely different relationship with the text. Not a diminished relationship, but a more honest one. A relationship that can hold the extraordinary moral power of the Sermon on the Mount alongside the question of where that power came from and how it traveled. That is not a smaller thing than the institutional version. It is a much larger thing. I put together some material on this that did not fit into the video. The connections between Buddhist philosophy and the earliest Christian communities go deeper than any single video can trace. The Asene question alone could fill 2 hours. I left something in the comments, a resource that goes further into the primary sources, including the specific Pali Canon texts that parallel the Beatitudes and the scholarly documentation for Buddhist communities in Alexandria. If you want to go deeper on any of what we covered today, it is there. You do not need to change what you believe about Jesus after watching this. The Sermon on the Mount says what it says. The moral teaching stands. In its beauty, in its radicalism, in its power to reorder how you think about the poor and the violent and the marginalized, regardless of whether it has Buddhist antecedents or not. The words are the words, but you might consider stopping to accept the institutional version of where those words came from, because the evidence suggests that the greatest sustained moral teaching in Western history was not delivered in a cultural and intellectual vacuum. It was delivered by a man who, through routes we can now partially trace in stone and scholarship, had access to the deepest streams of human wisdom that had been flowing through the ancient world for centuries before he was born. That does not make Jesus smaller. It makes the question of where human wisdom comes from much, much larger. You decide what to do with this. Here is the question I want to put to you directly. Coincidence or contact? After everything we covered, the systematic parallels, the Ashoka edicts, the Kandahar inscription in Aramaic, the Buddhist communities in Alexandria, the church fathers who knew, write one of those 2 words in the comments. I want to see where people land when they have seen the actual evidence.